All right, continuing on with our 80s, 90s, and 2000s coverage. Our last unit here for the year. Talking about the first President Bush and President Bill Clinton. Right, so we finished up with Reagan last time I spoke with you, and the camera's going to be a little bit off just because my tripod isn't very good. But talking about President Bush and President Clinton. Bush, who will, as we'll see, try just to run everything back from the Reagan administration because Reagan was so popular. And then President Clinton, who borrowed a lot. Even though Clinton, being a Democrat, is supposed to be more liberal, will borrow a lot from Reagan because Reagan was so popular. And we'll see from Reagan on to a little bit of a rightward shift in our political parties. So here we go. George Herbert Walker Bush, the first President Bush, just died last year. So born very wealthy in Massachusetts. What you need to know about the Bushes, including the second President Bush, which we'll also talk about in this unit, is that they're rich, super rich. We're born super rich. We're born into extreme privilege in their lives, and they will use that privilege to climb even higher on the American social ladder. So his father, Prescott Bush, was a powerful banker and senator who was sanctioned for trading with the Nazis for too long during World War II. However, his son will become a distinguished Navy pilot. He'll fly 58 combat missions, when the Distinguished Flying Cross was legit as a war hero during World War II. He went to Yale after the war on the GI Bill, although I'm not sure if he even really qualified considering how rich they were anyways. But he will get into Yale. He'll use his father's connections after Yale to enter the oil field business in Texas, then becomes even more wealthy, then decides he wants to be a politician. So first he starts as a congressman. After he was congressman, he was chosen to be the ambassador to the United Nations. So he will be our ambassador, I believe, under Nixon or Ford, one of the two. Then he becomes the chairman of the Republican National Committee. Then after that, he becomes the ambassador to China. And then after that, the CIA director. Then after that, the vice president. And then after that, the president. So he had a whole host of jobs all over the place. He's the only person ever to be president that had also been a CIA director. He's also independently the first president that ever had been the ambassador to the United Nations. So those are both a couple of big deals there. He will at times be very, very partisan as a Republican. As you can see there, he was the chairman of the Republican National Committee. But at other times he'll be less so, which we'll talk about most specifically with taxes. But I digress. So there he is on the left, young George H.W. Bush as he enters the Navy. There he is on the right, an older George H.W. Bush. As I said, he just recently died last year or the year before. So, George H.W. Bush, first question, held what positions before becoming president? There are three of them that are correct. Was it A, CIA director, B, the governor of Texas, C, the vice president, D, the ambassador to Russia, or E, the ambassador to the United Nations? Remember, three correct ones on that. All right, domestic policy, like I said at the very beginning of this lecture, he will not promise any big changes during his presidency. He basically says, we're going to keep everything going. On the third term of the Reagan administration is basically how he ran his campaign. His most famous campaign promise was that there would be no new taxes. Very famously, he'll say, read my lips, no new taxes. But then he will raise them after the election. Now, why was it such a big issue? Because the Reagan tax cuts, as we talked about last time, increased the national debt, and our deficit was getting out of control. And if we were going to maintain any semblance of a balanced budget, which Republicans claim is a big deal, at least when they're not in charge of the purse strings, and I'll say the same thing about Democrats, vice versa. So he says he won't raise any taxes, and that's going to be the big thing. They're going to say, if you elect Michael Dukakis, who he's running against, Michael Dukakis, the Democrat, is going to raise all of your taxes, right? But we won't do that. That was his big campaign pledge. After it's over, he decides that his obligation to the country's financial health was more important than his campaign promise, so he will raise taxes. That will crush him heading into the 1992 election. He signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which is very important. It's a bipartisan bill to make it illegal for employers to discriminate against the disabled, to guarantee access to places of business and public venues, and to expand access to public transport. It's also very, very, very important for education. He will sign the Clean Air Amendments Act in 1990. Okay? He was not himself particularly an environmentalist, President Bush, But we had this huge oil spill, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, where hundreds of thousands of gallons of crude oil spilled all over the Alaskan coast, which made all Americans more into the environmental mode, made us more environmentalist as a country, so they had to do something. We also had some issues with acid rain, right, where chemicals, exhaust chemicals and things from smokestacks get up into clouds, and then when they rain they have more acidic qualities and mess up paint on cars and can hurt people's skin and stuff like that. So the Clean Air Amendments Act, okay, passed in the Exxon Valdez sort of hangover period, the period where that's still big in the news, will seek to do three big things: reduce urban smog, curb acid rain, and eliminate industrial emissions of toxic chemicals. It did a very good job with curbing acid rain. We still have very bad smog in urban areas, including where I grew up in Salt Lake City. And we still have just wholesale toxic chemicals being dumped by bad people in big corporations. All right, so the Americans with Disabilities Act being signed, very, very important law that's been built upon since the 90s to increase the ability for Americans with disabilities to be a part of our society. So 2 positives out of George H.W. Bush's domestic policy were what? A, the Americans with Disabilities Act. B, the creation of the EPA. C, additions to the Clean Air Act. Or D, tax cuts. All right, more domestic policy. He signed an automatic rifle or semi-automatic rifle ban. Okay, he just signed this into law despite promising no gun control legislation during his campaign. President Reagan signed an assault rifle ban. President Bush continued it. President Clinton continued it. And then with the second President Bush, we haven't had one since. He let that lapse. So it was bipartisanly supported during the 90s to not have semi-autos or automatic weapons. So you can see we've changed as a country more towards the right on that, it appears, because we have no bans, right? Next big one, the Exxon Valdez. I talked about that a second ago. This is, I need to update this. This is the second worst oil spill in U.S. history, but it will be the worst in terms of a tanker, right? So it was in a big tanker boat full of crude oil. 240,000 gallons will be spilled on the Alaskan coast. It'll destroy a whole lot of wildlife areas. Very famously, Dawn soap becomes famous now. If you'll see on, if you go shopping and you see the Dawn soap, there'll be some of them that have pictures of ducks, right? Because during this, the Exxon Valdez, they used Dove soap, like dish soap, to clean off animals and get the oil off of their skin. But we've superseded this a whole bunch of times. The Dakota Access Pipeline has leaked more than this into the ground already, maybe even double this at this point. We had the Deepwater Horizon oil leak in the Gulf of Mexico, which was much worse than this as well. So we haven't particularly learned our lesson on not spilling oil. Anti-drug law. He passed $3 billion worth of expansions to the war on drugs. All of them appear to have been a waste of money because we decided, and I talked about this a bit with Reagan, but let's reinforce it a bit here with Bush and Clinton. Clinton's especially going to be bad on this score, where we decided that the best way to make sure people don't use drugs is to make the penalties super, super bad, right? And that obviously hasn't worked. We probably should shift more towards treating people with addiction instead of punishing them with jail sentences. But that won't happen. It still hasn't particularly happened at this point in our history, but it definitely wasn't happening under Bush and Clinton. Clinton's going to do some real bad things, but I'll yell about Clinton here in a minute. President Bush will veto the 1990 Civil Rights Act because he thought it had too much affirmative action. He will eventually approve the 1991 Civil Rights Act, which made it easier to bring discrimination lawsuits against employers. He also signed the Immigration Act of 1990, which brought some significant changes to the immigration system, including adding up to 700,000 immigrants every year. It started the visa lottery program and continued to give preference to skilled workers. The visa lottery program has become, I guess, a bit controversial under the Trump presidency. It is not literally a lottery where they don't check you or do anything like that. You got to go through like every background check imaginable through the CIA and the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security before you can be entered into this visa program. There's all sorts of other requirements to be in the visa lottery program, and basically what those requirements add up to is we want the best from other countries and to try to keep out anybody that we don't see as the best. So when I say that, we see here at the bottom we give preference to skilled workers. We love giving out visas to people with master's degrees or computer programming skills, specifically from India. Off the top of my head, I can think of it from China, places, or South Korea, places where that is a little bit more pushed towards, right? But we don't want to give visas to those people's cousins who might not have those advanced degrees. So that's where the visa lottery program and this preference kind of go together. Anyways, there's the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Right there you can see on the left in red, that's all the coastline that was damaged, some of it ruined. On the right, you can see the Exxon Valdez itself. So how did it crash? It ran aground, which means that there wasn't as much ocean as they thought, and that it's not the coast particularly, but the ocean floor is much higher there, and they don't realize how high it is, and their boat runs into it and gets stuck and gets split into, or it gets a big hole cut in it. Out of that big hole comes all that oil. All right, so true or false, George H.W. Bush signed a semi-automatic weapons ban. Is that true or is that false? All right, the economy. The economy went back into recession during President Bush's presidency. Unemployment goes up, consumer confidence goes down. The stock market will continue to do well, though. One thing I'd like to point out to you guys, and I'd like to reinforce this with you as many times as I possibly can. The stock market does not tell you really how well our economy is doing. It never does. It just tells you how well the stock market's doing. Most Americans don't own stock or don't own very much stock for that really to be a huge determinant in their lives. Just this week, I saw on the bottom scroll of Fox News that, or they were talking about it or something, they said, despite how bad everything's going right now in the world with COVID, the stock market had gains last week. An extra 3 million people lost their jobs last week. We got more than 30 million new unemployment claims. People are losing everything due to the virus and possibly inaction out of our government or other economic factors and stuff like that. But the stock market did well. So if the stock market is going up right now while everything else is going poorly for people, it shows you that it does not accurately measure how well our economy is doing, especially not on the ground level where all of us live. That's something for us to understand and internalize because both parties lie about it, right? During President Obama's presidency, Democrats loved that the stock market kept going up, hit record highs during President Obama's presidency. Conservatives pointed out accurately that that doesn't mean that everybody on the ground level is doing better, and that was true. Then Trump gets elected, stock market continues to rise. Republicans love to talk about how great the stock market's going, it's hitting record highs, and now Democrats are rightfully pointing out that it doesn't matter if the stock market hits record highs, it doesn't mean that regular people's lives are materially getting better. But I would, with my knowledge of our history, I would be willing to bet my salary that if, say, a Democrat, say Joe Biden, I guess he's the nominee, if he wins, that Democrats would immediately go back to talking about how great the stock market is and forgetting about the other stuff that they were talking about. Both parties do this. They've done it forever. I just want you to be smarter than the two parties. Anyways, the stock market, irregardless of the stock market, I should say, the poor economy really hurt Bush heading into his re-election campaign against Bill Clinton in 1992. Other economy stuff. The savings and loan industry completely collapsed due to under-regulation and extremely risky loaning practices. So we had to pass an emergency bailout funded by taxpayers. We talked about this last time, but it'll hit under Bush's economy. So it's a shared Reagan-Bush thing. APEC is founded in 1989. Stands for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. Eventually, it will expand to 21 countries, including the United States. It's what we call a forum for member nations to discuss and negotiate trade deals. It's been very important for us in the engagement of the Asia-Pacific region. One thing you'll see, and President Trump got a lot of votes railing against free trade deals like NAFTA. And there was one that they were proposing called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but that died. We're at the phase now, especially during the Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and forward years, but really the 80s and 90s, where America starts negotiating these free trade agreements with other countries. We have a lot of various free trade ones depending on what level we are with that country, right? So with Mexico and Canada, even with President Trump's revamped NAFTA, whatever, I can't think of what they're calling it, right? The U.S.-Mexico trade, I can't remember what he called it. USMCA, I think is what it was. Anyways, even with that, we have different levels of free trade, which means there's no economic barriers, and by that I should say there's no tariffs, right? So if we're going to trade with Mexico, there's really very low tariffs to no tariffs with most of the stuff we're going to trade with them. Same with Canada. Same with other countries, right? Free trade is generally good for our businesses. It doesn't necessarily mean it's good for our people. It's destroyed a lot of good manufacturing jobs, a lot of good union jobs. It's pushed a lot of industry to other countries because it's cheaper to own a company in, say, Ireland, where they can avoid paying taxes entirely, than it is to have them here. But it was a bipartisan effort to launch free trade agreements. And it is still one that I will tell you, despite the rhetoric you get out of presidential candidates, right? Bernie Sanders was the same. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party love free trade agreements. I wouldn't expect to see them ever go away because the people that fund their campaigns love them. But something for you to understand, because you're going to hear about free trade agreements all the time. All right, anyways, here is President Bush. Okay, he says he'll bring down the deficit further and balance the budget by 1993 with no new taxes. Said that on the campaign trail. And then here he is at the bottom right. It says, read my lips. I lied, right? Because he said, read my lips. No new taxes. If you squint in there, you can see there's a story in the New York Post that day about Donald Trump. It says Donald does it with a picture of him. That's back when he was just a real estate guy. So what famous promise did George H.W. Bush have to go back on? Was it A, no new taxes, B, no new wars, C, no new spending, or D, none of the above? All right, foreign policy. The Gulf War. Hey, Gulf War is a big thing. Okay, we eventually have to go back into the Gulf multiple times. So, country of Iraq. This is after the Iran-Iraq War and the Iran-Contra scandal and all that stuff ends, right? There's basically a stalemate between Iraq and Iran that ends in 1988. Very quickly on after, a couple years after, Iraq is going to invade Kuwait, right? After misunderstanding American messages. Basically, we had supported Saddam Hussein for a very, very, very long time, right? Throughout the Iran-Iraq War, even though we're selling weapons to Iran, we're still supporting Saddam Hussein. It wasn't until the Gulf War that we decided that Saddam wasn't somebody we wanted to continue supporting. And a big part of that is that he invades Kuwait to take their oil. Okay, Iraq was very low on money, right? Raging a war for 8 years costs a lot, so they were in debt, and they thought it would be really easy if they captured all the oil in Kuwait to sell it and then pay off all their debts. They asked us if we were okay with that. We said something very diplomatic that they thought meant that we'd be cool with it, which really didn't mean that we'd be cool with it. So they will invade. Saudi Arabia, which is close to Kuwait, will feel threatened by this. There were issues with some doctored photos alleging that Iraq would invade them as well. Yeah, we put this on TV. We had it in newspapers that showed these satellite photos that supposedly showed the Iraqi military, I should say, organizing thousands of troops right on the Saudi Arabian border about to pour in, right? And it turns out those were completely fake. But we fell for it. We fell for that imagery. The U.S. organized a coalition of more than 30 countries and led the attack to force the Iraqis back out of Kuwait. But we did not overthrow Saddam Hussein. Okay, we followed what the UN wanted us to do. Okay, George Bush did have some respect for the United Nations. They said, we want you to force them out of Kuwait, but that's it. And that's exactly what we did. It took 5 weeks of bombing and 100 hours of ground invasion before the war was over. Very few American casualties. The Iraqi military was nothing of a challenge for us at this point. Panama. The U.S. had supported dictator Manuel Noriega for a long time, since the 60s, so about 30 years at this point. I think it'll be 29 years, because I think we helped him overthrow him in 1989. He was on the CIA payroll. He was an informant. Okay, he was informing on other Central American and South American drug dealers. Okay, and we used his information to arrest some people, but somehow the flow of drugs continued to grow. And part of the reason for that was that he was the world's biggest drug dealer. But we overlooked it. The CIA knew, but they overlooked it. The State Department knew, and they overlooked it. Presidents knew and overlooked it because we thought that he was worth it. We thought the information he was giving us was more than enough to be worth all the drug trafficking he was doing. We decided in 88, 89 that he really wasn't worth it after he invalidated some elections that would have had him lose his presidency. So the U.S. troops will invade and help overthrow the Noriega government and install somebody else that we liked. A lot of things will happen with this. There was already a lot of tension around the Panama Canal Zone with American troops treating it like it was our property and not property rented from Panama. There will be us allegedly helping to mine the harbors around Panama, which is a war crime. A lot of haggling over how many innocent people died during all of this, but long story short, we helped overthrow Manuel Noriega. The Cold War will officially end under George H.W. Bush's watch. The Berlin Wall will fall, Germany is reunified, and they sign this Strategic Arms Treaty #1, the START 1 Treaty, is signed to help eliminate some of our nuclear weapons. All right, the Gulf War, right there. On the bottom right, they called that the highway to hell, where U.S. fighter planes continued to shoot at retreating troops, and also a lot of civilians that were mixed in with the retreating troops on this highway. Lots and lots of people are going to die on that one. All right, Iraq's invasion of what country helped lead to the Gulf War? Was it A, Iran, B, the United Arab Emirates, C, Egypt, or D, Kuwait? What country did Saddam lead an invasion of to repay his debts? We didn't like, and we will go in and force their military out. All right, the 1992 election. This will be the end of the Bush presidency. Bush and his running mate Dan Quayle, who could not spell the word potato, very famously will spell it wrong on national television, versus Bill Clinton and Al Gore, and a third party, Ross Perot, and somebody whose last name is Stockdale. You don't need to know his first name either. This will be a pretty interesting election here. We don't often have a viable third party candidate, but Ross Perot will get a lot of votes. Bush is seeking re-election. Okay, initially his approval rating was super high after the Gulf War, up in the 80s, high 80s and low 90s approval, which is something you never see anymore. But it'll drop dramatically with the economy as it drops as well. So by the time the election rolls around, his approval rating is under 50%, probably closer to 30%. Clinton will emerge out of nowhere to seize the Democratic nomination. It was a very crowded field, but he will eventually get the nomination. Ross Perot was a self-funded independent billionaire who was very outspoken, had some pretty crazy ideas, and bought a whole lot of airtime, kind of, in a way, Trumpy before Trump, a long time before Trump. He had some ideas that we considered crazy at the time that if you look back on were actually fairly rational. He had one about NAFTA specifically, where he said we should put a tariff on any country that doesn't pay their people as well as we do and doesn't mandate the same environmental or worker protections as we do, and eventually lower that tariff to equal it out as they go, which is an awesome idea that nobody would propose anymore, that Ross Perot proposed. So good on him for doing that. But in the end, Bill Clinton was much younger. He was cooler, and he was a much better public speaker than Bush, who was kind of seen as boring, as a square, kind of as your grandpa, sort of. Didn't seem like someone that most people had anything in common with. Clinton was pretty good at being an everyman, and he will win the election with 370 electoral votes, but only 43% of the popular vote. So up there on the top left, you can see Ross Perot and George H.W. Bush arguing. We had three people on the debate stage because they both were polling so high, or I guess all three of them were polling so high. And there's Bill Clinton talking in the foreground. Bottom left, you see Bill and a young Hillary campaigning around. You can see the electoral map right there. Clinton will be the last Democrat to win any southern states, but he was a southerner himself from the state of Arkansas, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But looking at this map, okay, George H.W. Bush got 37% of the popular vote. Bill Clinton got 43%, and Ross Perot right around 20%. By far the most a third-party candidate has gotten in modern American politics. Okay, so Bill Clinton, because he got under 50% of the popular vote, is what we'd consider a minority president, right? Got to get 50% or more. So he'll be a minority president. There he is right there on the left, a young Bill Clinton as president on the right, sort of what he looks like now. So, who is Bill Clinton? He was born William Blythe III. His father will die 3 months before he was born. His mother will eventually remarry to a guy by the name of Roger Clinton, and Bill will change his last name to match when he was 15 because he recognized that guy as his real father because his father tragically died. He was born poor in a town called Hope, Arkansas, and they would mine that for all it is worth because he's from a place called Hope. They'll use that in all of his campaign ads. After his father's death, his mother will leave him with his grandparents while she goes off to get a nursing degree, and then eventually she picks him back up. He, for all of his faults, and we're going to talk plenty about his faults because I'm not at all a Clinton fan, but he was a smart guy, went to Georgetown University, which is hard to get into. He was a Rhodes Scholar, where it's a hugely hard academic thing to qualify for, but they send you over to England to study at Oxford. And then he came back and went to Yale Law School. He was the Attorney General of Arkansas, the youngest ever, and then he was the youngest governor of Arkansas. And he was elected governor twice, from 79 to 81, and then again from 83 all the way till 92 when he wins the presidential election. Clinton was a good campaigner. That doesn't mean necessarily that he's a great person or a great politician or a great president, but he was really good at talking to people and campaigning, which is why he pretty easily won both of his elections. Anyways, there's a young Bill and a young Hillary talking about who knows what. On the right, this guy, his name is Arsenio Hall. Okay, he used to have the Arsenio Hall Show, which was a late-night talk show that geared more towards the black community and also towards younger people. And Clinton went on there and played the saxophone, and everyone thought he was cool, so helped him get some votes. He also was the first president ever to do any campaigning on MTV, reach out to the young vote. So, Clinton's domestic policy. Okay, let me take a quick drink of water here. Clinton is what he called himself, a new Democrat, okay, which means he was a centrist, which means he wasn't particularly liberal, wasn't very far to the left at all, despite what people might argue. He was very much a centrist. In fact, he will adopt something called what they call triangulation, where he will use a bunch of conservative ideas and pass conservative laws, because he thought if more laws he passed, the more successful he would look. He signed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that had been negotiated mainly by President Bush, lowered tariffs and impediments for trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Like I said, it was a bipartisan deal. It's been supported by both parties. The economic impact is mixed. Our GDP has gone up, although very slightly. It has been very good for businesses to make a lot more money, but those benefits have not been passed downward, right? A lot of jobs have been lost. A lot of worker incomes have stagnated due to a lot of the free trade deals that we passed, and NAFTA was the biggest. Welfare reform. The president to cut the most money out of welfare was a Democrat, Bill Clinton. He cut welfare in half. That's how he will balance the budget. By cutting welfare, right? Supposedly a liberal thing is to keep welfare payments, maybe even increase them, or benefits, right? Food help, housing help for the poorest and most at-risk Americans, but he will cut those. He'll increase work requirements, which is an awful way to distribute welfare stuff. President Trump has expanded that as well. And the reason I say that is that most of the work requirements require you to work to make enough, more money than you could qualify for any aid, but less money than you can really qualify to live. So it traps you in poverty when it should be a hand up. It's not particularly that way when we put some of these work requirements in. Anyways, I won't go too far into that because it just makes me mad. Anyways, part of his welfare reforms is set as a 5-year maximum of aid in your lifetime, including 2 years in a row max, unless you qualify through a whole lot of hoops to jump through, like lifetime physical or mental disabilities or something like that. Obviously, we know that people in our community that might be a part of the Social Security Disability Program, that's considered a welfare program as well, so you have to qualify for that, and it wipes away some of these requirements. 1996 immigration law that he passed. It made more people deportable and less people legalizable. So it really wasn't immigration reform, it was really deportation reform. Then the war on drugs, the crime bill. He passed a very notorious crime bill, and I will say that it was supported by both parties. Okay, it wasn't just something, but it did come back to really hurt Hillary when she tried to run last time. What the crime bill did is it mandated mandatory minimums for any drug crimes. There's a federal 3 strikes law, so if you got caught 3 times with federal level amounts of marijuana on you or other types of drugs, then you go to jail for life. And it barred anyone with a drug infraction from receiving welfare or public housing help. So here's a story, a hypothetical. Say you've got a little bit of weed in your pocket, you get arrested, right? We're in the 90s, right? They consider that to be too much weed for one person, so it's not just a possession charge. Now they're going to try to book you on distribution charges. You could be put in the state system or the federal system, as we talked about last time with Reagan. Black or brown people were 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be put in the federal system. So say you got put in the federal system, now you got a federal drug charge on your record. First of all, you got to spend your time, your mandatory minimum sentence. Then you get out. You're poor, right? You got no money. Obviously, you haven't worked for however long you were in jail. You're disconnected from family and friends and stuff like that. Maybe you don't have anybody with a spare room that you know, but you can't afford an apartment. You go and ask for housing help, but you can't get it because you have a drug infraction on your record. So then what do? What is your solution? How do you make money? Maybe people aren't hiring you because you have to check the box as you're a felon. Then what do? Right? You fall back into crime, right? Fall back into crime. And that's kind of how we set people up with mandatory minimums, 3-strike laws, and taking away any help you can get, any public help you can get if you have any drug crimes on your record. So in broad numbers, okay, did the crime bill make America safer? Probably not, although it's hard to distinguish, right? Because overall crime has gone down in our country for more than 30 years. Especially violent crime has gone down extensively in our country, despite what the news might show you, because the news shows a lot of the most heinous stuff because it gets better ratings, but American crime has gone down. However, through the drug bill, the effects on communities of colors were extremely harsh. Both President Clinton and then First Lady Clinton labeled some young Black and brown Americans super predators, and they did not forget that. They did not forget that when it came time to vote in 2016. Most of them, I'll say, they didn't switch parties. I would say they remembered by refusing to vote for someone who had called them super predators in the past. Anyways, on the left, there's President Clinton signing into law the crime bill. You can notice that there are people of color supporting that, and at the time, there was support throughout most of America for harsher crime laws aimed at drugs, but very quickly did the Black and brown community realize that those laws were structured in a way that was affecting them more harshly than others, in a way that wasn't conducive to the success for the war on drugs, and they started rallying against it. You can see here on the right, Clinton crime bill destroyed our communities. That's a protester at a Hillary Clinton rally in 2016. So, President Clinton's domestic policy initiatives included what? A, welfare reform, B, the crime bill, C, NAFTA, or D, all of the above. I'm going to pause here because this is going to be a two-parter, and I'll be right back.